Alright, the next part, or this part, will be about how to set up bitmap textures. This works like this. First of all, you create a new material just by going to the material manager, and then you hit create new material. Double click on the name and call it stone, for example. And now we will prepare our material so that we can put in some bitmap textures. I downloaded a few of them from Array Textures. That's this side. arraytextures.com. And it's a commercial site, but you can get those small textures for free, and they really have the best quality, I think. So there are several kinds of textures you need. So this at first is the diffuse texture. It only contains the color, and this color information goes to this tab here, color. We're gonna put it right in there. Next we have a bump map. A bump map only consists of grayish colors. Dark tones mean it's more like a hole, it's more inside, it's for all those gaps. And the brighter, the further it sticks out. So where does the bump map go? Of course to this here, to bump. And we can put that texture in here. And then we have a third texture, that's the specular texture. It works like that. Dark parts don't reflect, there will be no highlights on them, and brighter parts do reflect. And you can use this specular map for two things. First, you can use it for the specular, but as you see, there's no place to put textures in. Among specular, you have to put it to specular color. That's this one here, and then it'll work just fine. And then there's another way where we could put it. That's the reflection channel, but we will keep that for later. So now, just to load in the textures, make sure you have color, bump, specular, and specular color checked. So let's start with color. You should download those textures yourself. It's arraytextures.com. And if you just click here, you will find stuff like that. I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of thing you take. I went to Stonework Volume 1 and choose Stonework 2, and there's all those three maps: diffuse, bump, and spec, and you can download them without registration, just as a zip file. Okay. I did that already, so now if you're ready, we can start to put those textures in. I go to color and click on those ... sign. That way I can load a texture file in. It is here, 3D in my case. And there we go. They are kind of coded. D stands for diffuse, B for bump, S for specular. And the numbers tell you what values the author suggests. So let's start with Airway Stone D100. So I open it. In this case, it's asking me whether I would want to copy it next to the file, next to my Cinema 4D document, but I don't want this in this case, so I say no, and that should be fine. I put the brightness to 100%, so that should just be okay. Next is bump. I load in that bump texture here, B005, that means 5%. Say no again, put in strength 5, and then the only thing that's missing now is the specular color. So Cinema is asking for a spec texture, which is S100, and you can see this little preview here. And to make it really obvious, I just raise the height and the width within specular just to see the effect. So now let's create a cube again and put on that texture just by drag and drop. And maybe a light next to this, just one click for a light. And now let's zoom in a little and hit Command R for rendering. And the effect is really subtle, so I want to have a little stronger bump. So I go to bump and crank it way up just to see whether it works. And now I see it works. So this looks almost like in a computer game, so I want to reduce this a little. And of course this texture is stretched now. We will discuss how to properly map stuff in the next video, but in here it's just about how to set up textures. Okay, now let's switch over to Photoshop in order to be able to create our own textures, so that we have a color map, a bump map, and a specular map. And we're now going to learn how to do them on our own, just based on a photo. I took a photo last year how to just photograph on a wall. It's the best if you take photos like that either from the internet, so you save a lot of time, or if you need something special, then just go on a day when it's rather cloudy, like overcast, so then you can just you don't have any shadows or harsh lights on your textures. Apart from that, make sure that you photograph the walls really straight, on a straight angle, so that you don't have much of a distortion going on. If you need to, if your camera is kind of bending those lines here, let's have a look. I just hit Command R to get the rulers in here, and then I can check whether my lines are straight or not. And I possibly corrected this texture already. It doesn't have much of a distortion at least. In case your photo looks different, then just go to filter, and there should be a filter that corrects your distortions. It's distortion filter, and then probably something about objective or some correction. It looks like that. They have a kind of grid over the image, so you can tell whether it's straight or not, and you can correct the perspective in case you need it, and you can do this for horizontal distortion as well. And pretty important is, that's what the filter is made for, I think, to remove distortions. Maybe if you have your camera is an image like this, so you actually got, okay, that's a little too much, but if you got lines like this from a wide angle objective, then it's kinda distorted, and you can use this values to get it straight. So correct it in this direction, then it should be fine. That's the first thing you have to do with the texture. Next would be cropping it to the borders you need. I will need something like this. I go to crop. You can just hit C on your keyboard or click on that icon. And we should make sure that the texture is tileable so we can repeat it. So it should be a bit like this. So if you think about it, these are our gaps, and we want to make sure they are evenly spaced once we repeat them. So we take half the gap from here and the other half from here, and the same for the bottom and the top, more or less like this. And we should be aware of certain problems, like this gap is way darker than this one. So what will we do in Photoshop? We could correct this before or afterwards. So maybe we just leave it the way it is for now and hit enter. And now there are several ways to make this texture tileable. First we can, oh actually I think it's a little bent, but anyway I'm going to keep it like this for now. The most popular way of doing this works like that. You first copy that layer with a right click and then you say duplicate layer. Alternatively you can use Command J like this, and then you go to filter, other filters, and there is an offset filter. And what the offset filter does is just moving your texture along towards a different place. You can do the same for top and bottom, like that. And so that you have a cross in the middle. And now you can just put a mask on the top layer, like this, clicking on this symbol. And then you paint in with a black brush. With a right click you can define the hardness of the brush and its size. And then you then you can correct it. This works for grass and stuff like that, but not in this case. So maybe it's more clever to just take a part from the right hand side, copy it, paste it, and mirror it by width -100. Put it here. And make it kind of fade out just by using a mask. And this should be a lot softer and probably bigger. So this would be a base texture. We can do the same for the top, but first of all, let's delete this unnecessary copy. And now we hit Command E to just melt those two guys together. And let's use the same here from the bottom. Let's just pick a copy of the bottom part, hit Command C and then Command V for copying and pasting. Take this cross in the middle up to the top of the thing we just copied and hit height -100, so we copy it on top, pull it up, and of course we don't want an exact copy, that's kind of too obvious, but we can use the mask again to change the looks. Maybe not too soft, I just go back and make it a little smaller. And that would be a way to create a texture. Make sure the gaps are clean. And now I melt this together and call it diffuse. So far it's locked, so to unlock it just go layer from background and call it diffuse. So this will go into our color channel. Next we are going to take a copy of diffuse, hit Command J and call it bump. So in order to convert this diffuse map into a bump map, let's first make it a grayscale image, but we are not just putting it into gray, we're choosing how to convert it before by going on this black-white sign and go to something which should be called black and white. And there we have different presets, so we can choose the most interesting result. So you will see that there's a difference if you look at the dark tones in the gaps and the bright tones right here between a yellowish filter, which separates out the differences really nicely. All those stones here are really clean on their surface and the gaps are darker. If you compare it with the blue filter, blue sort of stresses more the differences on the surfaces, so this would be probably a really good candidate for a specular map, because we have sort of differences on the surface for how much it might reflect. It's really good. And then we have this yellow filter, which is very kind of easy, and it differentiates between gaps and sort of stones. The green filter would be something in between. It's a little more showing those kind of little bumps within the stone. Infrared is really stressing the highlights. Wouldn't recommend using this in this case. Black's not so bad. Maximum white is interesting too. Neutral density and reds. So let's just see what we're doing. We can use the blue filter as a base for our specular map. So we should have parts, then the bright parts will reflect a lot, the darkest not so much, either with high contrast or with a rather low contrast. I think I go for rather the one with the normal contrast to not overdo it. For the spec, and for the bump I use this one. Should consider, of course, that I have dark patches here and there which are not so nice because they simulate depth in a bump map, so I go for yellow anyway. So now let's hit Command E to melt them down, and this is our diffuse map. That's our bump map. And now let's take a copy of the diffuse map, hitting Command J, call it specular, and let's convert the specular map using using this black and white sign, and we go to black white, and this time we choose the blue filter. You know what, I take blue filter with high contrast, hit Command E, and that's my spec. Now I could use those maps the way they are, but we can optimize them a little. Let's start with the diffuse one. In some cases you might have a few highlights in there because mostly the light is coming from above, so there might be tiny bits that are a bit too highlighted too much. So in case you want to, you can use those gradation curves and sort of clip the highlights a little. Or we can try it differently. By just chopping them off. But I don't think in this case it's needed. But you might need other stuff instead. Sometimes you have plants in front or something you have to sort of stamp out. I will just give you an example. Let's say you take the this tool here just to remove something like this spot here. Then you would just hold down Alt, take something from there and click on this. Of course you can see a circle now, so we should make this a lot softer. And if you still don't like it, how about using a healing brush? Which works like that. Then it gets even harder to see that we cheated a little. There could be a lot more corrections to be done, for example the color. So go to those curves again and you can color correct those stones, for example using the RGB channels. By pulling out blue you can tint them yellowish. Only go for slight manipulation. You can put in more or less green, and you can change red it to red or reduce the red a little to make it look paler. I show you the difference. That was the original. It was kind of bluish and not very colorful, and you can tint them a little. It really depends on what kind of texture you need. You can also increase the contrast of the whole thing by either clipping them, so it almost looks a little too bright now, but now it's getting a bit more contrast, or you can use an S-curve in the RGB mode to increase the contrast. In my case, I'm fine with this, so it shouldn't be that dull, but it doesn't need to be like this either, so something in between will do. And that's it. I put that curve correction on an own layer from here, but that has one advantage: you can change what you did later on. But if you are happy with that, you can hit Command E again to melt it together. Now we can improve the bump texture next. You go here again to curves, and maybe you want to get those bright areas brighter. So if you just move the left mouse button, you can see what represents the bright areas in our histogram and what are the dark ones. And for bump textures you really want to make a difference between the bright parts and the dark parts. So let's just hit Command here while pressing left mouse button and Command here. And now we make this a lot steeper, so we really can differentiate between the dark parts and the bright parts. You can also use plateaus, that's really flat areas like so, to really make those blocks appear like one and the dark parts like a different part. Let's just make this even stronger. Of course, if you wanted to do it really good, then you should probably correct those dark corners, at least those and those guys, because in reality there won't be any holes. Quick and dirty like that. Let's just clone stuff over. Sorry, not from our curves, but from the actual bump. Okay, that's way too strong, but hit Command Alt Z to do more than one undo step. And let's try this again. Still don't like it. yeah, that would be one way of correcting that kind of stone. You really can spend ages on this if you like. Of course, we should darken this part here, so let's just copy one that's working fine. Maybe this one. Just use the rectangle tool and steal it from there. Copy it, paste it, use V to get back to mouse and put it in there. I work really quick now, or at least not very clean, by erasing parts I don't like. Didn't really get better, sorry. So let's just hit Command E and kind of smudge it maybe a little. No one's gonna notice, I guess. And actually we should darken this part up there. There's another method, just use a brush, take this dark color up there and paint over it. Maybe it works, let's see. Okay, let's not spend too much time on it. I now take the curves and hit Command E, so the bump map is called finished. And to spice up the specularity map, let's use the curves again. And first of all, we could brighten it up, but that would mean 100% specularity, which is probably too much. But if you want to, you can increase the contrast here so the gaps are not reflective and the rest is more or less. Let's hit OK and go Command E to melt it down. Now the cool thing about Cinema 4D is that it's able to read Photoshop and its layers. So we can just hold Command S and save this texture to a place of our choice. I put it in this case here. Call it own texture .psd. Make sure layers are included. Hit save. Okay. And now let's go back to Cinema 4D. Create a new material by double clicking on the gray. Go own and prepare my texture slots, my channels, by going color, specular and bump. So first is color, and now it should work pretty quickly. Click on ... Go to the folder with your own texture. In my case, I don't want a copy of that. And now I already see a preview of one of the layers from my Photoshop document. Now all I have to do is defining what layer I want to see each time. So let's just click here on this big field and go to layer set select, and now we can say, in this case I only want the diffuse layer. I go back up here and I see it worked. Now I have the right the right layer, and I just put it on my box and it gets replaced. The rule is quite simple. It works like this. The material on the right side overrides all the others on the left. So this worked in my case. This is what my texture looks like in with the diffuse only. So you can tell it has a really even specular. That's not what we want later, and it doesn't have a bump map yet. But we can do this real quick by going to our texture again, and now let's just copy that material by dragging it over from here to bump, go over bump, so you can tell the stuff below changes, and go down to texture and just drop it in that field. Now before we change anything, let's do the same step again. Take this field here, move it to specular color and drop it. Excuse me, but not there, but instead you go over and drop it here among texture. So all we have to do now is define for the bump what's the right layer. We go to, excuse me, I do it a little slower. We went to bump, then we click on this big field, then we have layer set select, and then I go to bump. Hit OK. I go up again, and I'll leave it the strength at 20 just for the time being, and go over to specular color, click on this big field here again, go to select, and this time I say spec. So let's go up and check whether our image improved, and I think it really did. Let's have a look. We have a real crisp image and probably even the illusion of depth here. Let's crank up the specular highlights just to make it more obvious. There you go. If I look from an angle right opposite to my lamp, I can tell that my spec really works. Can you tell it? Here it's brighter and there too, but where it's mud, there it doesn't work. So this could be quite a good texture. I wouldn't recommend to use such high specular, but it depends really on the lighting and the angles from where the lights come. So there's not too much I can tell about that. I seriously doubt that this texture is really well tileable. It's simply too small and maybe the edges don't work perfectly, but that's just a start on how to create your own textures. So what are we doing next? Maybe we should try to make a more diffuse, or how to say, a more organic texture, and we try to make it tileable this time. So for that we prepare a piece of grass. It's just a plane we need. Move it downwards, hovering over this arrow, moving it down, holding down shift to make this precisely. I leave it at 100. Now hit T for scaling. Alternatively you can click here and scale it up. So now how do we map, or not map, how do we create a texture of the floor? I will just have a look for a grass texture and we'll see how can we make this repeatable. Alright, I knew I had a grass texture somewhere, so it might be not particularly beautiful, but I think we can use it. So first of all, we need to check whether we have a vignette like dark corners, and in some cases we even have to remove certain items like trash or something that doesn't belong there. If you notice any distortion, you should know by now that you can remove it with this slider here, but what I'm after is this kind of thing. It's called vignette, so due to physics you have an effect like this in most cameras, but you can fight against it with Photoshop to make it look more even, and then hit OK. I just make the image a little smaller because I don't want to keep cinema too busy, so a smaller resolution will do for my cause. I go to cubic sharp to make the texture fairly crisp. If you wanted to, you could sharpen it as well, but I wouldn't overdo it in this case. It already looks sharpened. And now I personally like square textures better, so I hit C for crop. Alternatively, you can click here, and while pulling that rectangle you can hold down Shift to have it square shaped. So that way we're avoiding the maybe too bright or too dark corners, and I have an easy to handle texture within Cinema 4D, so I don't have to look up, is it wider than it's high or something like that. Square is simple. And let's just hit enter. So now it's cropped. And now let's duplicate the layer we have here by pushing Command J. And now, as I tried before, we're going to move the top layer with filter, other filters, and offset. And now you can see it's set off by, say, 500 by 500, and you should notice a little cross, like some lines going along here. That's the borders that used to be at the edges, and now they are at the center. So they just wrapped around kind of the image. And the trick is to get rid of those seams, for example by cutting them out or by using the clone tool. I personally like cutting out more, but it really depends on the image. So let's remove from this layer a few parts by using a mask and paint in with a black brush. And now something important, you could have a really huge brush which is pretty soft and just go over like this. That's what most people do. But there are areas that look really blurred by that, and apart from that it's not really believable, I think. So let's go Command Z, so we go back, go Command Alt Z to go more than one step back, so I have my crisp lines again. And it really depends on the surface and the scale of the image, but in this case I would recommend to use a little harder brush and maybe smaller, and you don't have to go really straight. You can kind of start to sort of move your mouse a little around so the eye can't really follow where you've painted and where not, and that way you might be able to fake a piece of grass. If you messed it up in some parts, just change the colors either by clicking here or by using X key, and you can paint back. So the good thing about masks is you can't really do mistakes. just hit X, go back, and yeah. I know it doesn't look perfect now, we could go on here for a while, but the only thing that counts is, does the viewer notice or not. If you are happy with that result, we should check for a few things, like if the brightness is evenly distributed, or if we have darker parts like this. In some cases there's plenty of tricks on the internet on how to kind of equalize the lighting of a texture. What I would pay special attention for is spots, because in some cases you have spots that are just too obvious. So when you tile this texture and repeat it, maybe the viewer will look at this dark spot over and over again, so that he can easily tell, okay, that's a tile texture. So what I'm trying to do now is just to make this texture appear more homogeneous, like same. So there shouldn't be special spots. That's the one thing you have to avoid, is spots, and the other is banding. So when I just hit Command A to select all, and now Command Shift C to copy the whole image with all its layers, and now I hit Command N for a new image, I can paste it in, and maybe I should just load this image in a pattern. Works like that, Command A, and then you go to define pattern, like here, define pattern, I call it grass, and that way, now when I create a really huge texture, like 4000 by 4000, and hit enter, and now I use my fill bucket, just the usual fill bucket, and I go from foreground to pattern. I can choose this pattern I got here, that one, and fill it. And now I can have a look what's going on. I don't notice so many spots, but what I notice is banding. Like I have lines running vertically around here. Let me just highlight them there. Those are the guys who annoy me a little, like here. And let's just check where that is on our texture. That should work quite simply by, by looking for 1050 on here. So I just use a rectangle, give it the fixed size 1050 by the same value, and okay, it should be left to the center. There's something running across, so somewhere here there, okay, this is too dark in the middle and I see this contrast from there, so we will have to do some more Photoshop work here at this place. So let's use maybe the clone stamp to brighten that up. Okay, so usually we would be busy with that for quite a while, but I don't want to get this tutorial to go too long, so we're just using Command E to put this on one layer, and you can save it, for example, as Photoshop file. I go to Stan, what's the name, 3D and then I put it to my tutorial files, sorry. So let's have a look how it works. This time we don't have a bump map created or a specular map, but we'll see anyway how it looks. I go to grass and just pick the grass texture here in my new material, put it on there, and now if your preview is too blurry, then you can do the following: go to editor and go to texture preview size and put it to 1000 by 1000 so it gets sharper. Remove the specular. I don't think we need it in this case. And now we have grass applied next to that block. Of course this is way too big. We should resize it, but first of all I want to give you another advice. If you want to get textures even crisper, there's a way. Go to the own thing, like our texture. You can change the sampling from MIP to, it's called Alias 1. That's even crisper. So if you need stuff to be really crisp, you can set it to Alias. This works for bump as well and for specular color too. So that would be the maximum quality so far. Now let's have a look at some simple things within Cinema. First we want to care about the texture tags. Please consider the following. We have one thing that's the material that looks like this in the attribute manager, and we have a material tag that's this little ball here. So there's a difference if I click here or there. I think we are through with all the texture settings for now. Yeah, and now let's care about the texture tag. I just clicked on my grass tag. I can see basic here. That's just the name of the tag. I don't really want to change that. So let's go next to tag. I can change here what kind of material I use, and I could use all those settings I had before in the material manager, but I will close it. We can map it just to a selection of our object. We do this later. I can change the projection. It works fine at the moment, but there's more we can change. And now for the interesting thing is tiling. That means repeating a texture. If I set the length U and V to half the value, my texture repeats now. So as you can tell, I got the same texture 4 times now. The original is one here, then there's a copy, and there's a copy of it. And by decreasing this value, you can make this grass smaller. In both directions the same, because I got a square texture, and that would be an image like that. So that's the first thing you have to do. That's quite common to scale the textures. You can either use tiles or %. You can tell that influences each other. If it's set to seamless, let's have a look. I can't really tell the difference. If you're curious, you could go for show help, but I'm not at the moment. Okay, let's render this out. Okay, I think that the floor is not really crisp, could be sharper. So maybe anti helps. Alias 1, sorry. Didn't get much better, so maybe the overall image resolution is too low, or we should generally make it crisper in Photoshop. We'll see. Okay, that was the first thing about the texture tag. Then you have coordinates. They work like, okay, they don't work because of the mapping we have right now. So let's just start with the mapping. Mapping works like this. Just imagine you have a volume here, and you have to put the textures on them. This works via projection. So you have to imagine like a video beamer that has an image of the texture, and it beams all the colors needed on the surface. And there are several directions how this can work. I just use my stone texture here, and by standard there is UVW mapping preset, but this works pretty good for those objects, for parametrical ones, but this is probably not going to work on your CAD models. You can tell that so far our texture is just stretching along with the geometry. That's not what we want, of course, but to solve this we have a lot of projection modes, and the rule of thumb, I don't know, like the main rule is that you have to use the projection, the kind of projection that is the closest to the shape you're projecting onto. So if this is rather cubic, then why not choosing cubic? There you go. The great thing now is when I change the width or the dimensions of my block, the texture doesn't really care. Really good, and my texture should not be distorted much now. If you want to visualize how these things or how the textures are mapped to your surface, just click on this checkerboard, and now you have a cage that indicates where your projection comes from. So this is cubic, and this means our texture starts from this edge and runs here, and from here on there's a repetition. So let's just use other projectors. That's a spherical one that comes from pretty much any direction from the globe. It does not really fit to what we're doing. You can tell by the rendering that's a really strange projection, and spherical projections are there for spheres. The cylindrical as well, that's producing some effect like this on top. It works halfway on those surfaces, but it's not really beautiful. Of course, you would use the cylindrical projection for cylindrical shapes. So when I go back to this mode here, to the object mode, I can show you. Let's just use the stone texture for the cylinder as well, render it out, and you can tell it works. Let me just deactivate the light. It works really well for a cylinder. It really wraps around, there's no seams to be seen apart from the top bit, but we'll find solutions for that. Really nice. So what kind of projections do we have as well? Flat one. This comes just from one direction. works really good for this side, stretches along those sides. Cubic is what we had before. Frontal comes right out of the camera's view. Rarely used in architecture, as far as I know. Spatial is a way of wrapping stuff around, never use it. I don't, at least. UV mapping requires a UV map, which we rarely have in our CAD models. In many cases they are messed up at least. So to sum it up, mostly you're going to use cubic mapping, and in some cases stuff like spherical, flat or cylindrical. So now for the next question, let's just move this out of the way. Quite often you would like to move your textures across the surfaces. Works like that. You click on the texture, then you go to texture axis mode, and then just like as if you were moving an object, you can move it by going here to the move option and move it so that it fits perfectly here. Maybe like so. Have a look at the top. I mean, it is perfect now, but you still have the option to move it. And that's it in this case. How about if you wanted to change the scale? You could either do what we did before, change the length 50 and U, so it's getting smaller. You can tell this texture is not really good for tiling vertically, but that's not our problem now. Or you could do something a little bit more fluid. Works like this. You just go to scale mode, and then you can squeeze and stretch the textures just the way you want in any direction. Of course, you can rotate that texture cage as well by going to rotating. Doesn't make much sense here, but let's just hit Command Z and I show you where it makes more sense. That's the case with the cylinder. Go to texture mode and let's rotate this stuff around, so you could even on a pillar say where there are the gaps and the stones and so on. Here too we can hit T for scaling and scale those things down. Sorry. And if we want to have them a bit closer together, we can change their length U and make them look like this. Okay, one more thing. What if you want to mix two textures quickly? Say on the ground here, you would like to have some more sandy parts, like so. This is supposed to be a sand color, and you want to mix it with the grass. I just name it sand here, and the trick is to go to alpha channel, click on alpha, go to texture, use whatever you like. I use noise. I make the noise fairly big, 600%, and maybe a bit stronger in contrast. I go back up, so that's what my my sand will look like. And now I can just map it on the plane, and as you can tell in the preview, now it's mixing up. That's because of the alpha. So it works like that. The material that's right on the right side may have or should have holes in there created by an alpha map, and all the black parts become invisible, and that's why we can see the grass. Rendered, it looks like this. Of course, this is not perfectly what we want, but by tweaking the noise shader we have in our alpha channel, we can make this look better and better. It's quite often it's about this correct scale. And sometimes you may not even want this to be 100%. Oh yeah, in this case you do. And if you put on something more interesting instead of just the plain color, maybe some noise here for the sand in the color channel, then it might be worth looking at it. Maybe something like this would be a good start, and that's how you mix two colors with each other, or two materials, just by alpha. So there's another thing I would like to show you, and it's about giving one object. Sorry, we click here on the Use Model button. What if you want to give one object more than one material? You can do so by converting the object by clicking here. And maybe let's just remove those materials for now. You can just click on them or use a rectangular selection and hit delete. Now I have the blank object again, it's converted. So let's go to polygon mode, click on top of it, drag over the first texture. I use the stone texture here, and just the top is textured. Now I choose the other polygons I want to put another texture on, just by going to polygon mode and clicking on the respective surfaces, and again just use drag and drop. This time I take my own texture and put it on here. So what we just did was two materials, you can tell here, one material, the other one, on one object. How can you sort of check what it did? It works like that. In each material tag there is an entry called selection, and it says polygon selection .1. That's this one, polygon selection .1. That's, by the way, the polygon selection tag. And in the other material it says where are you applied to, what's your selection. It's polygon selection .2, which is this one. And if you double click on them, on those selection tags, you get back in polygon mode, and Cinema 4D highlights or selects those polygons. So if you would like to change stuff, like for example you don't want this part here to be in stone, then you can work like this. Go to this selection tag, hold down Control, click on the polygon you want to remove from the selection. Now make sure the selection tag is still highlighted, and then you go to Select and say Set Selection. So now the material own is not any longer applied to this selection tag, because from this selection tag, this polygon was just removed. So if you want to have that stone texture which is on top to be here as well, just have a look at the stone texture. Look here, polygon selection dot one. That should be polygon selection 1. Alright, double click on it, and now you hold down Shift, click on this empty polygon, and now go check again that it's still selected, polygon selection 1, and go to select, set selection. Now you have it in full control. You can, of course, remove those tags if you wish. Then it's losing the information where to be applied, so now this material is not connected to any polygon. It's kind of looking for selection 2, which is not there any longer. You can just delete it, highlighting it, deleting it, and press enter, so it's gone. Now what happens there, of course, this material is having a polygon selection here, but it's getting overwritten by this material on the right, because this is not interested in selections or something any longer. That just puts his texture on all sides. So if you don't want this, you could either put it on the left hand side, so now in the important parts which are in the polygon selection 1, this material overrides its left neighbor, or you could just remove this bright texture, then those are blank again. So to make it like it was before, you could use just delete the tags, the selection tags, and leave it all empty. Alright, that was a basic introduction into using textures, creating your own textures, and in mapping.